Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March meeting and program of the San Fernando Valley Unit of the League of Women Voters of Greater Los Angeles. We're very glad to have all of you here with us today. I'm Joyce Batten, acting today as chair of our unit.
Stop it.
I suspect that some of you in our
Joyce, you just went mute. Just
how's that?
better. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I suspect that some of you in our audience may be new to the league. So I have a few words to say about who we are and what we do. We are a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we try to influence public policy through education and advocacy. So that's who we are. I have a couple of announcements to make. We did have an outdoor fundraising event originally scheduled for February 25th, but if you can remember back that day, it was a very rainy day. So the event has been rescheduled for Saturday, April 22nd. Hopefully our weather will be better that day for Anne's beautiful backyard. And our San Fernando Valley unit sponsors a book club. Sue Strickland will mention the next date and book. Sue?
Thank you, Joyce. It's a pleasure. Welcome. We just finished yesterday a delightful and instructive discussion of our book for March, which was Those Angry Days by Lynn Olson. It took a look at the period in America between 1939 and 1941. Prior to our involvement in World War II formally. Our next book is Being Human by Judy Heumann, spelled Heumann. And that discussion will be on May 10th. We meet every other month. That's a Zoom discussion, and if you are interested in joining us, I will put my email address in the chat, and I will be sure that you get the link closer to the meeting. And we do welcome new readers, and I hope you will decide to join us. We have a good time.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sue.
Joyce.
Okay. And we're looking forward to seeing you all again on April 20th for our very timely program. The subject will be water. What could be more timely than that? Okay. And now on to today's program. Jean Thompson, our program chair, will introduce our speaker. Jean. Jean? Jean. Where are you, Jean?
Okay, as she said, our nationwide League of Women Voters is nonprofit, nonpartisan, and we study multiple situations confronting us. Because of the vital importance to so many in our current lives, many local groups throughout the country are reviewing the knowledge and updating the many changes made recently in the immigration process. So this particular day, we're going to cover upon an investigation of the many local organizations all over the country who are assisting new applicants and currently residing immigrants in the United States, we have been impressed with the unique and comprehensive legal representation offered by an organization called Immigrant Defenders Law Center, founded in 2015. This group believes that the right to counsel in deportation proceedings is necessary due to the process for all. They offer legal representations to immigrant children, challenging some deportation orders, attempting to reunite separate families, support deported veterans, and participation in justice funds helping originally detained immigrants. This is a tremendous range of clients and assistance. Our speaker, Lindsay Toczylowski, the executive director of IMDEF, graduated magna cum laude from San Diego State University and obtained a JD from University of Southern California Law School. Her expertise encompasses human rights law, immigration, refugee law, international development, and the rule of law. How's that for a bond? She is also on the board of directors of Asylum Access, an international nonprofit that fights for the rights of refugees in the South. Her expertise encompasses human rights law, immigration, refugee law, international development, and the rule of law. That's quite a mouthful. Now I am honored to introduce our speaker, Lindsay Toczylowski.
Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be able to speak to such an engaged group and was really honored to be invited. Please let me know if you have any trouble hearing me or any questions. I think they said at the beginning you could put those in the chat, and I'll save some time at the end for what I imagine might be many questions. Immigration law is one of the most complex areas of law that exists. And I, since graduating from law school and prior to that, have been an advocate for immigrants and refugees for over a decade now. When I was working at other nonprofit organizations, I really saw a gap in the availability of legal services. I myself have sat, in immigration courtrooms here in downtown Los Angeles, where I've seen infants so tiny that they have to be carried in by social workers, appearing by themselves without an attorney. And a lot of people don't realize that we have courtrooms in Los Angeles where children, where people who don't speak the language, where people who have mental incapacities, where everyone, while there may be a right to counsel, they don't have counsel provided for them. So unlike our, dependency or foster care courts where all children are provided a lawyer, or our criminal courts where, the consequences of someone potentially being incarcerated even for 1 hour makes it that deprivation of liberty rises to us giving them a lawyer in that courtroom, thinking that that is a fundamental right that people have. In immigration courtrooms, we don't have that, even for the youngest people appearing before those courts. What that means is that we have courtrooms, there's an immigration judge, Judge Marks, who once said that these are death penalty cases happening in traffic court. And that is really true, because these courtrooms are not treated with the seriousness of what the consequences can be for the people appearing before those judges. And the reason I say that is because for someone who's seeking asylum, most of the clients who we represent are, and my organization represents more than 3,000 people here in Los Angeles each year. For those folks who are seeking asylum, if they don't get due process in that hearing, they can be sent back to a place where their lives could be at risk, where they could lose their lives. So the stakes, and sorry if there's background noise, it's downtown LA, as I said, but the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. And so I was working at other nonprofit organizations. I've spent my entire legal career trying to increase access to justice and increase access to due process, increase access to counsel for immigrants. But what I realized is that there was a gap between the charity model of providing people legal services and a rights-based model. In my mind, and the reason that I founded my organization in 2015, is that people have a right to due process in the United States. People should have a right to be able to have themselves defended when the potential outcome of a court hearing is exile from their communities, permanent separation from their families, and in the most serious of cases, potentially losing your life. So I founded Immigrant Defenders in my living room 7 years ago with a laptop and my co-founder and 2 other staff. And we had, big ideas that we would be the first outpost of a public defender system that would help to make sure that no immigrant is forced to go to immigration court alone here in Los Angeles. That idea has grown exponentially. We've moved from my living room many years ago, 7 years ago, to now be the largest deportation defense provider in the state of California. We provide all of our services for free. We now have more than 150 staff full-time providing services out of 4 offices here in Los Angeles as our headquarters and our largest office. We also have an office in Riverside, another in Santa Ana, and then in San Diego. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides, and don't worry because I will not be just, let me see. And are you able to see that slide that I shared? Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I will not be reading, but I wanted to share some photos with you so that all of you can see some of our clients and see who I'm talking about. So I'll start with the client that's in this photo. His name is Armalindo. He's there with one of our legal directors, Eliana. And, one of the times when a lot of folks became really interested in the issues that my career is focused around was in 2018. When the Trump administration opted to separate children and their families at the border as a way to have a cruelty-first policy that would really deter other people from coming to the United States and seeking help. And whenever I, re-explain to people what 2018 was, I just want to pause there and say that that policy and policies that I'll talk about that continue to exist was really taking our asylum protection system and looking at ways that we could treat some of the most vulnerable people with cruelty, with the hope that fewer people would come ask for our help in the future. And I think that's a really important thing to pause and think about what that says about the values, not just of the prior administration, but of the country as we think forward to what our immigration policy should look like. Armalindo and his son, who's 6 years old, were one of those families. I met him at a detention center, the father here in Los Angeles. His son had literally been taken from his arms at the border. The picture you see there is after we intervened, filed a federal lawsuit, and that's actually in a waiting room at LAX, where LAX was nice enough to give us space where we actually had them reunited. When I think about the core of the work that I do, I mentioned when I first started the organization, I was hoping that we could make sure that nobody has to go to immigration court alone. But the idea of immigrant defenders and the idea of the movement that we're a part of is much bigger than that. It's about making sure that our immigration system does not separate families unjustly. It's about making sure that no immigrant is forced to face an unjust system alone. So I'll talk more about this, but what went from us wanting to make sure lawyers were in courtrooms has really branched out into us wanting to make the immigration system more humane, more just, and also make sure that people have access not only to lawyers, but to justice in courtrooms where it currently does not exist. And so what I'll start off talking with, I was thinking a lot of ways to sort of structure the remarks I was going to give today. And I thought what might be the most effective is to kind of start where most of the migrants that we encounter are starting, and that's in Tijuana, Mexico. So we opened our cross-border initiative in 2018. The team in the top right corner you can see is part of our San Diego-based team. And on the left is what our San Diego-based team focuses on, which is, you can see in that photo, it's one of our lawyers, Shoshana, giving a Know Your Rights class in a shelter in Tijuana. And you can see in the background of the photo are the tents that people are living in that shelter. Currently, because of many different laws that have happened over the last 7 years, but particularly a directive called Title 42, which is something that went into a place we're actually about in 5 days going to have the 3rd year anniversary of Title 42. Title 42 was a public health directive in March 21 of 2020. I'm sure we all remember well, the world was essentially shutting down. And the Trump administration took the opportunity, or took that moment, to do what they had been trying to do through many other tactics over the course of several years, to actually shut down our asylum system altogether. So on March 21, 2023, Title 42 came into play, initially touted as a way to prevent the spread of COVID. But what it said essentially was that no asylum seekers could come into the United States. Our borders were closed that day. That's the first time since our asylum statutes were passed in the aftermath of World War II. It's important to remember where our asylum protection system comes from. At the end of World War II, because of instances that happened, like the ship, the St. Louis, that came from Europe holding almost 700 refugee children from Europe, mostly Jewish refugees. It was turned away at our shores when it tried to dock in New York. It was turned back, and the vast majority of the children on that ship, and the vast majority of them, were returned back into Nazi Germany and its territories. They were sent to concentration camps, and many of them perished. In the aftermath of that, we rightfully as a country said, that violates our American values, that violates the words written on the base of the Statue of Liberty, that violates who we are as a country. And so we, at that time, created, the asylum statute. We've signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We became obligors to international treaties around the treatment of refugees. Unfortunately, in March of 2020, our system completely shut down again. And one thing that is not on the front page of every newspaper, and despite how much I talk about it, is not something that people really realize, it has not reopened. As of today, Title 42 is still in place, which means when we go down into the shelters in Tijuana and give presentations to tell people what their options are, we really are letting people know that there are very few options to seek asylum in the United States right now. Our border essentially remains closed to the vast majority of asylum seekers. And, there are some programs that are starting to reopen that process, but what we haven't seen is the ability for the most vulnerable. And I'll tell you about some of them that I've seen recently, because I'm in Tijuana usually every other week. Some of the most vulnerable are unable to, as they have since the end of World War II, come to a port of entry and ask for asylum. That's something that has always been in place and is not currently. There are additional things that are happening that we expect. Right now, we're in the middle of a public comment period, and I would encourage you to visit, and I'm happy to send to Jean some of the websites that folks, if they're interested in making public comment on the proposed rules that the Biden administration is currently seeking public comment on, I would encourage you to do that, and I can send some materials. But there is right now a new rule that's being proposed that would essentially limit asylum to anyone who has transited through a third country on their way to the United States. This asylum ban that's being proposed would essentially make it so that everyone I see in the shelters, who are mostly women traveling alone with children, many have fled gender-based violence, many have fled political persecution from Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, none of them would be eligible for asylum if this rule goes into place. We do expect litigation if the Biden administration, despite public comment, chooses to move forward. But this would essentially change our asylum system into where I fear would be where we may once again say never again. Never again would we send the ship back to Nazi Germany for so many innocent people to perish. But again, our border would be closed in the same way. So one of the things that we recognized when we opened our cross-border initiative was that it wasn't enough to put someone in a courtroom in Los Angeles if people didn't have access to the asylum system at all. So we created this as a way to bring our services to where our clients were. So we cross the border, we provide free legal services, we provide consultations. But unfortunately, because of the current system that we're living in, because of the real political controversy that exists, there is no political will for us to really solve the humanitarian crisis that exists at our border. So from my perspective, we are providing legal services, but we also are providing a voice for so many of the moms and the children who, when I go down to Tijuana, you hear harrowing stories of, fleeing in the dead of night from political persecution in Cuba, flying into Nicaragua, coming up through Central America into Mexico, and coming to the United States and knowing that that is the only place that you can seek safety. And unfortunately, many of them are having a door slammed in their face. I will say that there is some hope that the Biden administration will reverse some of the policies. It's been in fits and starts, and it has not reversed many of the Trump era policies that exist. But we continue to fight for border policies, for immigration policies that really center the humanity of the people seeking help, that treat people the way we would want our own families to be treated if we were to find ourselves in that situation, and that follow our obligations under international law and under the US asylum statute. In sort of summary of that, what we seek is that people are welcomed with dignity to the United States, and that means giving them due process so that they can make their asylum claim. One large group that Immigrant Defenders serves that this applies to are children. About 2/3 of the clients that we represent are children under the age of 16. So we have one of the largest programs in the country that provides free legal representation to most children in Southern California who are facing deportation. So just to give you an idea, because it's a very complicated system, the way that this works is that because of the restrictions on asylum that exist at our border, there is an exemption for children who are traveling on their own. Therefore, when we talk about our current border policies creating family separation, it's because families don't have a mechanism right now to seek safety together. And so you can imagine, especially for the parents who are on this call, you can imagine what you might be thinking if you're sitting in a shelter, traffickers are outside the door, you're afraid for the life of you and your children, but you know that your children may be able to seek asylum without you. Unfortunately, for many parents, that becomes a real Sophie's choice, in the sense of, I am not going, we're all in danger here, but potentially they can get to safety. And so that is one of the reasons that we've seen a huge increase in the number of unaccompanied children coming to the United States. When unaccompanied children are either caught entering the United States between port of entries or present themselves at a port of entry to Customs and Border Protection, they're taken into custody. And you may remember at the beginning of the Biden administration, some of those horrible photos of children under bridges. That was when children were being bottlenecked in the custody of Customs and Border Protection, because there was such a large flow of children at the same time, they couldn't move them out quickly enough. That problem has been rectified because the administration and the law in the United States requires children to be moved away from the border within 72 hours. And they're moved into the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Many people don't realize that here in Los Angeles, we have 24 shelters that house unaccompanied immigrant children. Immigrant Defenders provides legal services for all of those shelters. We have teams in the shelters every single day that are providing a Know Your Rights presentation for each and every child. And we provide a consultation for each and every child. If those kids, when they leave the shelters, remain here in Southern California, either with foster families or because their families are here, and I should mention, of course, Los Angeles is one of the largest receiving cities, both of migrants and of unaccompanied children in the country because of our immigrant populations. We will continue to represent them throughout their case. So, otherwise, if it weren't for organizations like us, when those children were released from government custody and they went into immigration court, they would be appearing by themselves and they would be expected to defend themselves, to apply for asylum on their own, and to be able to navigate that entire system. So we represent thousands of children every year. On the left, you can see one of our clients in our favorite type of picture to take, which is with his green card after he has won his case. But our children, our youngest child clients are just a few months old. And, we represent children all the way up through 18 and young adults who are, once they are released from government custody, still facing deportation. So for most of these kids, we are seeking asylum on their behalf, which means that we are seeking the protection of the United States because we believe that they would be subject to persecution were they return to their home countries. But these cases take a long time. So on average, a child's immigration case can take anywhere from 5 to 6 years to complete. And that's because for many of them, the backlog in the United States is more than 2 million cases that are pending in our immigration courts. So it is a long process. We also provide case management services and other services to help welcome these children into our communities and support them so that they can be active participants in their own defense. Another group that I just wanted to mention that we represent, there is one group that here in the Ninth Circuit, so here in California, we are able to represent at government expense, and that is people who've been deemed mentally incompetent to represent themselves. And the reason I wanted to just take a moment to talk about this program is because the program that exists is because of an ACLU lawsuit that called the Franco Gonzalez v. Holder case. In Franco Gonzalez v. Holder, there was a man who had been held for 7 years without his case being resolved. He was held in immigration detention center. He had deteriorated rapidly. He was unrepresented, and the government was essentially not moving on his case, just holding him, in perpetuity in an immigration detention center. So the ACLU and Public Counsel, another partner organization of ours, sued the federal government to say that you can't hold people who are mentally incompetent in immigration detention without providing them a lawyer. In 2015, this case resulted in a settlement that agreed here in the Ninth Circuit. The Executive Office of Immigration Review, the Immigration Court, will pay for appointed counsel for people who are deemed incompetent to represent themselves. I will say this does not include children. So children are not deemed incompetent to represent themselves, but only people with profound mental illnesses. So I'm really proud of this program. IMDEF was one of the first providers in the country to be part of this appointment system, and we've had incredible success. And I'll show you a slide later on that has one of our clients who, similar to Mr. Franco Gonzalez, the person who the case was initially brought from, was also held in immigration detention for 7 years before IMDEF was appointed to his case and got him out of immigration custody in a matter of months. We also have what's called our community defense projects. These projects are funded by local governments. So we have a program called Represent LA that's funded by the County of Los Angeles. We also have something called the Long Beach Justice Fund, the Santa Ana Justice Fund. And this is where local governments provide deportation defense for community members who are either detained by ICE or who are facing deportation. This can be both new residents who come to reunite with family and are facing deportation while they fight for asylum, but it's also the stories that you hear about on the news where, I always use the example because it's my neighborhood, but in Highland Park, there was a dad who dropped his children off at school and was picked up by ICE as he walked away in front of his children. Rightfully so, that caused a lot of outrage in the community that happened in front of the school community. But for the local officials,
you suddenly become mute.
Lindsay, I believe you froze. I don't know if you can hear us.
Can you hear me?
The picture is frozen and no voice.
Great. All right, so I think we are back. And can you see my slide again?
Which one?
Yes,
Yes.
It's
community defense projects.
yes.
Thank
And so our community defense projects are really trying to, we advocated for our local governments to be able to, for them to be able to really invest in our communities and make sure that those types of cases not only had the support, but that they were also making sure that they were looking at the ripple effects of what a deportation does to our community. And so for many of these cases, what folks don't realize is that there is such a ripple effect in terms of homeowners being losing their home, people losing their jobs, also children being placed into our local child welfare situation. So we really wanted to show our local elected officials that it was important to invest in that community defense, because there are all of these ripple effects that happen when deportations happen in our communities. So the next slide is around our litigation and advocacy programs. So we were looking at, when we have folks who are at the border and they are coming here, we were thinking, initially they need a lawyer in the courtroom. And as part of our process of realizing over the last 7 years what we need to create the reality of an immigration system that will actually be more humane is that we really needed to look at other tools in our toolbox, and beyond just putting a lawyer in a single courtroom, but thinking about how do we create systemic change. So 3 years ago, we started our litigation and advocacy program. The one photo that you see there of a client and I in front of Capitol Hill is part of that, where I went with our client Gerson. Gerson, I'm very proud to say, he came here as an unaccompanied minor 6 years ago. His case was recently approved, and he's going to have a green card soon. His case was approved. We're just waiting for the actual card to get here. I took him to Capitol Hill last year to really talk about what unaccompanied minors can represent for our community. Gerson is a junior at UC Berkeley. He came here 6 years ago. He was just starting high school. He did not speak English. He learned English. He, is planning to go into education. He's a really exceptional person, but it shows that for him, he ended up coming from the border, going to a shelter here in Los Angeles. He met an IMDEF attorney in that shelter. I ended up representing him, and now, he is exactly representing the hope that we want to see in all of our unaccompanied minor clients. He tells the story, and he told this on Capitol Hill to lawmakers, of when he first came to the border. He's from El Salvador. He asked for asylum. And this was right at the beginning of the Trump administration. He asked for asylum, and the first question was not, do you need water? How can I help you? The first question was, what gang do you belong to? Gerson actually fled because gangs were persecuting him, in part because he was a member of a soccer team. And they felt that the soccer team was keeping kids out of the gangs and interesting them in soccer. And because of that, other members of his soccer team had been murdered in El Salvador. His mom sent him his mom was here. His grandmother, who was caring for him, sent him on the journey because she feared that he would be next. And again, with all of the folks that are sitting in front of me in Tijuana and with Gerson, I think I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I can only imagine if I found myself in the situation where I thought she might be next, what sacrifices I might make to save her life. So Gerson's doing really well now, but he is part of our advocacy because we realized that in order to make our system work for our communities, we needed to look at ways to change the system itself. Our litigation team too also looks at ways that we can have lawsuits that will change the system to improve and make it more humane. Just last night at almost 10 o'clock at night, I got an email that a case that we're currently pursuing called Immigrant Defenders Law Center versus Mayorkas. This was a case challenging the Remain in Mexico policy, which was a policy that sent people back to Mexico to wait for their asylum case to be heard while they were waiting in Mexico. We just found out last night that the Central District of California has certified it as a class. And our hope is that now that they've done that, we'll be able to prevent this type of program from ever being started again under any administration. The next slide that I have here is about our deported veterans program. So I wanted to make sure that we talk about this. It's a program that the first question people usually have is, why in the world would you need to have a program for deported veterans? Unfortunately, we do. And sadly, I can tell you that we are the only program in the country that focuses an entire team exclusively on bringing our veterans home. So just to give you an idea of why we have deported veterans. So from the Vietnam era all the way through until now, there is no policy to automatically naturalize people who are in the US Armed Forces. So if you have a legal permanent resident who is serving in the armed forces, which is legal to do, you don't have to be a US citizen to serve in the armed forces. If you have a legal permanent resident and they come back to the United States after serving in combat, if they are suffering from, I'll say what is the most common scenario, many of them are suffering from PTSD for the same reasons that we have a large population of homeless veterans in the United States. We also have a high percentage of immigrant veterans who, have issues with the criminal justice system. So in many cases, this could result in people self-medicating. They are then entangled within our criminal justice system. And one thing to know about immigration law is that it is incredibly unforgiving. The laws that have been passed over the last 30 years, most of them passed in 1996, before I graduated high school. Those are the laws that we are working under. And it was in a different era in terms of how we look at criminal justice, rehabilitation, the racial justice issues having to do with our criminal justice system. So immigration law mirrors that era's thinking on, the bad immigrant versus good immigrant narrative. It's not in line with much of the political discourse today, but it's incredibly unforgiving. So for example, when we have a deported veteran who has a drug conviction, that's a deportable offense. Once that case is in immigration court, there is no discretion from the immigration judge on whether or not to deport that person. In immigration law, it's almost like mandatory sentencing in the sense that if you are this legal status, you're a green card holder, and you've been convicted of this crime in the criminal justice system, I have to deport you. Doesn't matter if you have a child with special needs at home. It doesn't matter if you don't speak the language in the country I'm deporting you to. It's an unforgiving system of law. That's why we have the litigation and advocacy program to try and change that. But that's what we currently live under. So for deported veterans, all of them have been deported because of some criminal history that happened subsequent to their service. I'll tell you very quickly the story of Laura Mesa. She's my client. She is the only female deported veteran that we know of in the United States. She was deported in 2009 after getting a conviction in the District of Columbia, which made it a federal offense. Even though it was a criminal conviction, it was a federal criminal conviction. She was taken into custody. She was flown to a detention center in South Texas, where she was unrepresented and deported to Costa Rica. She was also a combat veteran. She fought in Iraq. She was a medic. She saw some absolutely horrific things that I will not repeat on this call. And she was also a victim of military sexual trauma where she, and it was substantiated, was raped by another US soldier while serving in combat in Iraq. All of this trauma, she came back and became addicted to drugs, committed a crime. She was deported to Costa Rica and has been separated from her US citizen child since 2009. That child is now an adult and has a grandchild so she's been separated from her own mother, who is a US citizen, her US citizen child, and her US citizen grandchild. We actually filed for humanitarian parole to allow her to return. We found out last week that she'll be returning to the United States this month. She has waited 14 years to come back, and it's a combination of immigrant defenders advocacy, but also changes in law that have happened under the Biden administration that we help to advocate for that are allowing deported veterans to come home. All of the veterans who are here on the screen that you can see are veterans who we brought home. And Alex Murillo in the top right there was another Iraq war vet who came home. I had met in Tijuana because he was one of the volunteers that helped with interpretation for pro bono lawyers who came down to Tijuana because, of course, he grew up here in the United States. He had come here as a toddler. He had been exiled to Mexico for 11 years. He also founded an organization called the Unified U.S. Deported Veterans, one of our partner organizations, and he came home in May of last year. And I also wanted to share a video here, and I'm hoping it's going to work. So please tell me if you can't hear the sound once I play it.
Yes, I consider myself a U.S. citizen. I consider myself part of the United States of America. My representative was able to take and have the court reconsider and drop it down to a misdemeanor. And now I'm able to possibly get over to the United States one day, God. She's constantly asking me to please to go over there, and I tell her, Mom, it's I'll be there when God allows me to go over there. I go, but they're working on it, and I'm very, very excited. Hopefully, it happens sooner than I believe, but just waiting patiently with a very, very happy heart that I know that maybe one day soon I can get across once again to visit my mother before she passes. It's necessary for President Biden to keep his promise to bring all deported veterans back home and to stop deportation on all future veterans, because there's probably veterans as we speak that are going through deportation. God, we all miss the United States. That's where we were brought to believe that is our home. That's who we are.
And so what I'm really happy to share is that Leonel, who you saw in that video, this is a picture from last week where he was home. He came back into San Diego, and the director of the Immigrant Veterans Initiative came from DC and held a ceremony with our staff and with Leonel and another client of ours at the Veteran of Foreign Wars, the VFW in San Diego, and Leonel was sworn in as a US citizen. This was because Immigrant Defenders was able to go back into criminal court and overturn his original conviction. We have a post-conviction relief team that works in our California criminal courts to look at convictions and determine whether or not there is a way to either overturn the original conviction if it was an unconstitutional conviction, or see whether there was ineffective assistance of counsel. In many cases, veterans and others are not told by their attorneys what the immigration consequences might be of, for example, a plea deal. When that happens, there is case law that says if you weren't advised of these additional consequences, we can reopen that case. In his case, the district attorney, because we're in a different era than when his case was initially convicted, they were able to reopen his case, and the district attorney opted to dismiss his case, which allowed him to come back in as a green card holder and be sworn in by the director of the by the Department of Homeland Security. So as I mentioned earlier, immigration law is incredibly unforgiving, and in many cases it can be unfair. It can shock the conscience of the outcomes that we have. The client who is pictured here is at a Starbucks outside of the Adelanto detention facility, which is one of the largest immigration detention facilities in California, and it's only about 90 miles from Los Angeles. He spent almost 7 years in that facility. Not because he had committed a crime, not because he had been sentenced to do time, but because he was mentally incompetent and the government held him in custody while not moving forward his case. Once IMDEF got on his case, we were able to get him released within a matter of months. And that's his sister, who hadn't seen him outside of an ICE prison prior to this meeting at Starbucks for 7 years. She knew she had a brother with mental competency issues. She knew he was ill. And so, those are the types of stories that really keep our team going and make it important, the work that we do. For us, we know that every time we walk into an immigration courtroom or walk into a shelter in Tijuana, that the odds are really stacked against our clients. The odds are stacked against our communities. But for us, we have to redefine success, because we're not able to get a green card for every client. We're not able to bring every deported veteran home. But what we do know is that our presence alone in the courtrooms, the fact that we are going into Tijuana, and even when there are no options, we're making sure that people understand not to pay someone money that will just steal their money, and when there are no options. We're giving moms and their kids who are traveling alone good information. All of that makes what is a very inhumane system more humane. So we know that our presence right now is a success. And that's something that for us is really important, whether that is to make sure that a child doesn't go into a courtroom alone, to make sure that somebody doesn't, try to enter between ports of entry because they don't understand the consequences of that, to make sure that, a child in a detention center here knows that they can call their parents. All of those things that our lawyers, we have almost 70 lawyers that work for us full time. Every single day, the services that they are providing make an inhumane system more humane. And so that's why we do what we do. I just wanted to share this last photo with you before we go to the question and answer. I took this on my phone as some families were leaving a Know Your Rights presentation that we had finished at a shelter in Tijuana. And these families, as you can see, almost everyone that we do our presentations for are families with children, often, traveling with small children. To me, the fact that they were able to come, get information about what's happening so that they're not listening to rumors, so that they know what their options are, lack of options are, that they know who to come to when they know that they can follow our social media, that they can contact us when there are options available is really important. And I particularly love this photo because it shows not only sort of who we're talking about, while also protecting their identity because they're turned around. But in the foreground, you can see a mural that's on the wall behind them, which is actually a mural that was commissioned by the U.S. United Deported Veterans at the shelter in Tijuana, where we most often provide legal services. And it says "No one left behind." You can't see all the writing, but that's what it says. And Alex Murillo is actually the one who I told you about, we were able to bring home last May, who founded the organization, is the veteran who's featured right in front of the American flag in the middle of that mural. And to his right above him in the pink shirt with the glasses is Laura Mesa, a picture of her who we'll be bringing home next week. So just wanted to share that and provide some context for that photo. And we can go to Q&A.
Wow. Okay. See if I,
Very impressive.
yeah. How are you funded?
So and did that stop my sharing? Just so I make sure.
You're still sharing.
I'm trying to figure out how to. There we go. So our funding comes from a variety of sources. We receive most of our funding for unaccompanied immigrant children from the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So they're required to provide services when children are in custody. And so once the children are released, we're able to continue those services. We also receive a lot of foundation funding from most of the big foundations here in Southern California. I mentioned, we have funding from the County of Los Angeles, the City of Long Beach, the City of Santa Ana. But actually most of our work at the border is unfunded. So we rely on individual donations and on fundraisers. We have a gala that we do every year in May. That's because the work that is being done in Tijuana to provide these services is something that traditionally foundations don't fund things that are happening in Mexico across the border. And of course, the US government is not funding those types of services, nor are local governments. So that's really a program where we rely on individual donations. Also, it's one of the reasons that programs that trap people in northern Mexico and don't give them access to asylum are so challenging because unlike IMDEF is one of the only organizations that regularly crosses over and provides those services, and that makes it a point to have that as part of our cross-border initiative. Something like the Remain in Mexico program, which forced people to stay in Mexico, was incredibly effective in ensuring that almost 0% of the people in that program had lawyers when they went into immigration court in the US. IMDEF actually represented more people in the Remain in Mexico program than any nonprofit nationwide.
Wow.
And Joyce, would you like me to go ahead and read the questions in the chat? Would that be easiest?
No, I can see them right here.
Perfect.
Let's see, question for Lee. Does LWV National have positions that allow us to write op-eds or letters regarding Biden's impending and current asylum policies? I think that's something that we need to ask. You probably are not aware of what League's positions might be. There are all kinds of comments about your excellent presentation. You are making a difference. And this information is important for all of us to hear. Apologies, I have to leave early. Great thanks to Lindsay and LWV and so forth and so on. Thanks for an excellent presentation. You are making a difference, and this information is important for all to hear. Thank you for we need to understand how all these laws and social factors converge to impact an immigrant veteran's life. Let's see if we can find a question here. Oh, here's one. Congress won't change the law, but public pressure on Garland can change the orders he gives judges. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so that, that's a really interesting facet of immigration law, because one issue is that immigration judges are not actually real judges in the way that most federal court judges are judges. So it is not an Article 1 court, it's not an Article 3 court. Immigration judges are actually staff members of the Department of Justice. So that question or comment is exactly right, that immigration judges are under the purview of the Attorney General. So there are certain things that the Attorney General can do, and we saw that, wielded to incredibly destructive results under the prior administration. Attorney General Garland also has incredible power in the immigration space to undo some of those things. Additionally, immigration judges themselves are really attorneys of the Department of Justice that are titled as immigration judges. And so they can be hired or fired by the Attorney General. They are not, that creates an incredible amount of undue pressure depending on the administration. And we saw that during the Trump administration with directives coming out that really restricted the discretion. And the Immigration Judges Union was actually, the Trump administration sought to decertify the union. I think that case is ongoing at the NLRB. So yeah, it's a really interesting aspect. And it's one of the reasons that our organization and many organizations believe that one reform that needs to happen in immigration courtrooms is for there to be an independent immigration court. Much in the way that we have independent tax courts, we would never consider having, the tax judges be, staff of the IRS. We don't think that the Department of Justice should have immigration judges be staff of the Department of Justice. They should be independent federal judges like most other courtrooms around the country.
Thank you. Let's see. Do all these groups have a means to exchange information and coordinate their work? I think they're talking about other organizations such as Al Otro
Al otro lado.
at ACLU providing legal services for, I think they're asking all the other organizations that provide legal services for asylum seekers at the border, do they have a way to exchange information and coordinate their work?
Yeah, so actually, Al otro lado, one of the organizations they mentioned there, and Immigrant Defenders are the co-leads of the Legal Services Division of what's called the California Welcoming Task Force. So the Welcoming Task Force is a group of about 80 organizations statewide that meet monthly and that also collaborate on services for asylum seekers. That we have a humanitarian arm, which is led by the Jewish Family Services of San Diego, which runs the largest migrant shelter in the state of California for families. This is where, when families are able to seek asylum in the United States, when they are able to be admitted as an exception to Title 42, or for any other reason, or because of the constant changing laws that happen, when there is that window, Jewish Family Services receives them. There's a migrant shelter that's supported by FEMA in San Diego, and then Al otro lado and Immigrant Defenders on the legal side provide the legal services in Tijuana. And then we also work to coordinate efforts statewide to ensure that asylum seekers who end up in any of our communities from the Bay Area to LA or the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, that they're receiving, that they're being connected to legal services organizations that provide free services throughout the state.
Thank you. Okay, do you have a lobby in Sacramento and or Washington?
So we don't. Our policy advocacy is based here in Los Angeles, but we partner with organizations that do. So we're part of a national coalition called the Welcome with Dignity campaign, which is based in DC. and we're one of the partners for that. We're also part of something called Fairness to Freedom, which is based out of the National Partnership for New Americans and the Vera Institute of Justice in New York. That is a campaign that's a long-term campaign pushing for universal representation for all people facing deportation. And then we also are closely partnered with the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, CHIRLA, which has a Sacramento office. And so most of our California-based advocacy is done in collaboration with them.
Mhm. Okay, let's see. Are migrants seeking, oh, excuse me. Are migrants, where was I? Oh, yeah. Seeking asylum ever caught up in ICE transfers by local law enforcement because of charges they have in the criminal system? Would they be protected by SB 54 in California?
Yes.
What protections are in other states?
Yeah, so yes is it's sort of a yes to both of those. So the yes, we have people who are transferred from ICE custody or from criminal custody into ICE custody. And there are laws protecting people convicted of certain crimes from that happening in the state of California. And we are seeing that largely protected. The larger transfer issue that we're seeing right now is we have, once people are in the custody of ICE, there is very little to prevent ICE from transferring them out of the state of California. So for example, one of our attorneys had a case this week with a client with mental competency issues who was detained here locally in the high desert. And overnight he was transferred to Denver with no notice to his family and no notice to the attorney. In that case, he was represented, but you can imagine how difficult it is for families when their family member is transferred out and they don't have an attorney. We were able to find him and may be able to continue to represent or assist or find a partner organization to assist. But this is one of the reasons that we are part of the Fairness to Freedom campaign and pushing for universal representation nationally, because here in California, even though very few detained immigrants have access to attorneys, it's still more than other places. And there's nothing to stop ICE from transferring people from prisons and ICE prisons in California to places like Stewart, Georgia, or Louisiana. And there are some facilities in Louisiana and Georgia where we have judges with less than 2% success on their cases. That means if you have a family member who was detained here in Los Angeles and ICE chooses to transfer them to Louisiana, they're, not only much less likely and probably, going to be completely unable to get an attorney in that region where there are almost no lawyers serving the populations that are detained, but also that much less likely to be in front of a judge that would be sympathetic to their case at all. So essentially, once people are transferred out of the Ninth Circuit into places like Georgia and Louisiana, they don't have a lawyer and they're in incredibly difficult places. In Stewart, Georgia, there's a judge who only has like a 1% rate of granting cases. If you're appearing before that judge and you don't have a lawyer, you essentially have absolutely no chance of leaving that ICE prison except through a deportation flight.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I don't see any other questions in chat. I don't know if anybody else has a better look at chat than I do.
Joyce, Catherine has her hand raised.
Oh, good, Catherine, yes.
Thank you. So yeah, I've been reading the chat and there have been a number of responses, including mine, to the question of National League advocacy.
Yes, I see it right here now, yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Yes.
yes. There, and just so if everybody would read their chat box, it's all there. Just to also let you know, there are 2 grassroots League of Women Voters membership Google groups formed one at the national level and one at the state of California level, specifically to support education and advocacy on immigration issues. And to also urge collaboration with organizations such as Lindsay's and Al Otro Lado and Shirla and others. If you'd like to know more, please look for LWV Immigration Interest Group, which is the national one, and LWVC Immigration Interest Group, which is the state group. They're both active and growing Google groups. So just there is stuff happening out there.
Yes, somebody has noted that it would be powerful to be able to consolidate our voices as league if we can refer to a position. So that would be very helpful.
It is a position. It's a relatively strong
Yeah.
Position. It hasn't been updated in many, many years. And if you'd like to know more, please check with those two immigration interest Google groups. You can learn about them. Beryl is here.
Yeah, I see a hand up.
Yeah, she could put the info in chat. I don't have that handy offhand.
Beryl, I see your hand up. Beryl, are you are you muted, or can you
I will
unmute?
put my email in the chat for you all. We'd love to have more leaguers in both the state and national immigration interest groups. Catherine and I and some others are leaders in both groups. I had two questions that somehow got overlooked.
I'm
One
sorry.
is, what happens to children who turn 18 in the middle of a court case?
Sure, I can answer that one first and then your second one. So in some cases, it's not an issue if they turn 18. It depends on what form of relief they're pursuing. Here in California, one of the reforms that we pushed for, there's another, I didn't talk about this earlier, but another form of relief that many of our child clients are pursuing is something called special immigrant juvenile status. And this is a status for unaccompanied minors who come to the United States and are unable to be reunited with one or both parents because of abusive or neglect, and who also a judge in the United States finds it's in their best interest to remain here. Not an immigration judge finding that, because there's no best interest consideration whatsoever in immigration court, but a state court judge finding that. If a state court judge finds that in the United States, we're able to apply through USCIS for this visa, which can be a defense against deportation. In California, we were able, through something called AB 900, which was a bill that we lobbied for, to extend the ability for children to pursue those types of immigration, or those types of state court proceedings through the age of 21. And so that allows for people who've turned 18, but still could be subject of a custody agreement or a dependency, that it allows them to continue to pursue that. And so for most children, there is not sort of a hard stop at 18, but there are certain protections that only exist for those under 18. And I've had this situation where, somebody who is on their way, who is traveling and migrating to the United States, when I meet them in Tijuana, they turned 18 a day before. That means that they are subject to the total asylum ban that currently exists through Title 42. And unlike, someone else who's a week younger than them, unable to avail themselves of protections meant specifically for unaccompanied children.
My granddaughter, her birthday was changed by the government in in Qatar. And so by the time she got here, she was days away from being an adult.
Wow.
Anyway, my other question is about the Afghans and Ukrainians. Their humanitarian parole time is coming to an end. What do you think is going to happen here?
Yeah, so the Ukrainian humanitarian parole was actually just, I believe, this week extended. And so, that sort of also highlights one of the things that we've seen, which is, and I want to be very careful to make what I'm going to say next very clear. Ukrainians have been treated as we would hope all refugees are treated when they come to the United States. They were very quickly brought to safety, those that were at the border, and they have been given, expeditious protection by the US government, including the parole extension this week. Unfortunately, at the same time as we've seen that, Afghanis have continued to, they do not have the same extension granted that Ukrainians were granted this week. And Afghans in general, there is a much longer backlog when you look at the data. It's taking, many months longer to get Afghan refugees through the process that was designed for them than Uniting for Ukraine. I helped a friend with a Uniting for Ukraine application in January, and it was approved 2 weeks later, and the person is already here. I have Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Cubans who, since January, we have been trying to help them who are in Tijuana, and none of their cases have been approved yet. So, there is a racial disparity between how Black and brown migrants are treated at the border and in our immigration system and Ukrainians. I do think for Afghans and Ukrainians, there's the political will to do the right thing in both of those situations. So my hope is that the Afghan extension will be granted as well. But what we would like to see is the same type of welcoming and prioritization of dignity that we've seen for Ukrainians extended to all refugees. Because, there's one stark difference, which is the color of their skin that is and where they came from, being from Europe and not from Latin America or other regions of the world. But I think that says a lot about our values and about the political will in this country. I did also want to mention that I did put in the chat the Immigration Justice Campaign, a link to it, which is a campaign that Immigrant Defenders, you'll see our logo on there, is pursuing right now, which is asking everyone, if you've been interested by what I said on the asylum ban and what that would do for our asylum system right now. Their individual comments, organizations can also make comments, but definitely encourage absolutely everyone to make them. They can't move forward with the proposed rule until they read every single comment submitted. And I think it's a really powerful opportunity for all of us to make sure that our voices are heard on our values being reflected in asylum policy when it comes to the asylum ban.
Are there any other
Who
hands up?
made that decision about the Ukrainians?
Who made it? It's the Department of Homeland Security extending the parole. So yeah, it would be USCIS and which is part of Secretary Mayorkas's department.
Right, thank you.
Are there any other hands up? I don't see any right here. I'm wondering on what grounds would a person's asylum be denied? What are the usual reasons for denying once you get to the court system?
Yeah, so there are many different reasons, but the most common I would say is that, our asylum system and our asylum law was created in the aftermath of World War II. And so it was created for the world that existed then. It's very much crafted around the idea of a Nazi government persecuting people because of their religion. And so that framework doesn't work as well in the era of climate change and the era of non-governmental actors doing the persecution, cartel violence, gang violence, governments being unable to protect or unwilling to protect their citizens. It doesn't work as well for people who are being persecuted because of their sexual orientation. It doesn't work as well for people who are being persecuted because of gender-based violence, domestic violence, because they are women. And so what we've seen is a framework that was created in the aftermath of World War II, trying to be applied to a very complicated geopolitical situation in 2023. And so the vast majority of our cases that are denied are because the person is unable to kind of fit that, I always forget how the phrase goes, but the square peg into the round hole or whatever it is. It's not because the judge doesn't believe that this person may be in danger. That's not enough. It's not because the judge doesn't believe that this person is fearful. That's not enough. You have to meet very specific criteria that, without real overhaul of our asylum system, and I would say particularly in the era of climate change, where climate change in the future is going to be driving so much of the migration that needs protection, without a real change to make our asylum system work for the world we live in now, we're going to continue to see people return to danger.
And so what needs to happen to change the World War II post rules?
So some of it is the Attorney General can update some things. So we saw that happen with the Attorney General granting gender-based violence as a reason that people could seek asylum taken away during the Trump administration. And then that Merrick Garland did reinstate that. But one of the challenges that we see is that we need actual changes in the law so that things don't change with every administration. And so because Congress has been essentially, unable to agree on any sort of immigration packages since the 90s, we're still working under an immigration system, both when it comes to asylum, but also when it comes to, our immigration system generally, that is not designed for the era that we live in. And so really what we need is to see both improved case law, and that's something that IMDEF works on every single time we file an appeal, but also we need to have an overhaul of our asylum system so that we have legislation that is designed to protect more categories. To be honest, I don't know if I'll see that in my career. I don't know if, our current politics will improve enough to have that sort of change. And so that's why we work on more Band-Aid approaches in terms of who qualifies and who doesn't, in terms of changing the case law. That being said, if we were able at some point in the near future to pass comprehensive immigration reform, it would lessen the number of people that need to rely on asylum as the only option. Probably many of you have heard that idea of, people should get in line. I had to wait for my papers and people should get into line. That is one of the biggest myths that exists in immigration law. There is no line. Right now, if someone were to file paperwork to bring their sibling from the Philippines, the applications that they're processing are applications that were filed when I was in high school. I'm 43 years old. It is a lifetime that it can take when we're talking about a system that is not designed for the world that we live in now. And then when urgent situations or persecution, arise, the only system that exists is asylum. And then when we talk about shutting that system down to everyone 3 years ago, we really end up in a situation where it's almost impossible to see without, comprehensive reform of the system, how we get out of sort of this constant cycle of humanitarian crisis at the border.
You've given us so much to think about. Thank you so very much. Does anyone else have any last minute questions? If not, I just want to.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, who said that?
It's Beryl Flom.
Oh, hi, Beryl. Yeah.
Lindsay, what do you think immigration reform might look like? What are your ideas?
So, there are two things primarily. There are some things that could be fixed almost instantaneously. As I mentioned, we have more people in immigration removal proceedings today than at any time in history, more than 2 million people nationwide who are in proceedings to be deported from the United States. We also have more than 13 million people who live in our communities undocumented, particularly here in LA. That's a major issue. And so one of the things that can happen, and Chirla has an excellent campaign on this right now, is to change the registry date. Right now, there's a registry date decades ago that if people came to the United States prior to that date, they are able to seek to have their status regularized. That registry date could be changed by an act of Congress. It could be changed to a year ago. It could be changed to 5 years ago. It could be changed to 10 years ago. That would massively bring massive numbers of people out of the shadows and allow them to regularize their status. Secondly, we need to look at family unity within the context of immigration. That has always been the bedrock of U.S. immigration policy. But of course, over time, and there are entire college courses on this, but it has been rooted in racism in a lot of instances in its application. But when we look at family unity, we need to look at ways that we can keep families together and that we can make it easier for people to legally bring their families here to the United States. Currently, we have millions of people nationwide living with temporary protected status. And one of the things about temporary protected status is it doesn't lead to any green card, and it doesn't give you the ability to bring your family members here to the United States. Many of the unaccompanied minors that I see are coming here to rejoin family, grandmothers, grandfathers, their parents sometimes, who are here in the United States and have temporary protected status. That is not a solution, the temporary protected status, and we need to look at permanent and enduring solutions that give people stability and keep our families together.
Thank you.
Just more notes in the chat about excellent presentation. Thanks, on and on and on. So that's my message as well. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I think it's certainly given us a lot to think about. And thanks for spending the time with us. We really appreciate it. You were wonderful, wonderful presentation.
I do think she froze again. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.
Well, I want to thank
Oh, go ahead.
Lindsay and her helper that calls me all and tells me all I need to know. It's been great talking to both of you. Thank you.
And don't forget that we will be meeting again a month from now, approximately, for our next
Yes, we've just got the
presentation.
flyer is out now for you'll all get for next month.
Right.
It's going to be on water.
It'll be water, yes. A very timely topic, water. Right.
If you haven't all drowned in it, we'll have another league.
Yes. Thank you all for your attendance, and remember us next month.